Alrighty, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm gonna fix my camera. Okay, so today we're gonna be just talking about domestic violence. What does that look like? What does that entitle? October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So this entire month, we're kind of focusing on making sure we know the awareness signs of domestic violence, making sure that we understand what we can do, what our rights are as people that are just passerbyers or even people in those situations. So what do I have access to? What do I need to know? How do I get out of those situations? So we'll just go ahead and get started. We have to start with defining what is domestic violence. So domestic violence is a pattern of abusive behaviors used by one individual intended to exert power or control over another individual in the context of an intimate or family relationship. So this is really important for us to state that it can be any person in that family entity. So it can be the woman, it can be the male. A lot of times we only look at it from one perspective and say, oh, it's always the male that's being the domestic abuser, but women have the same capability of being the domestic abuser. So we need to remember that. Also, it's any family relationship. So if there's grandma, grandpa, aunt, uncle, if they're living in that environment, then they are now also in the family dynamic. Therefore, if they are trying to exert power or control over another individual, that is still domestic violence because it's happening domestically. Another thing I always like to mention is roommate conflicts that become where someone is a domestic violence to the other roommate. That is classified as domestic violence too, because it's happening at your home. It's abuse that's taking place there. So if there's someone that's being very controlling and it's a pattern, important to state that it has to be a pattern. So a one-time event is assault. It's still illegal. It's still not good, but it is not domestic abuse until there is a proven pattern. And a lot of times with that proven pattern, we have to have multiple stops along the way stating that this is taking place. So if multiple people are reporting the same violence, then we have multiple people reporting the same violence. And so if somebody is reporting, then there's at least a paper trail, which is a really good thing to have whenever we're talking about domestic violence, because it has to be a pattern of abusive behaviors. So I should have clicked to the next slide a little earlier, but it includes several instances, and then it involves an interrelated pattern that includes a wide variety of abusive behaviors, usually increasing in frequency and over time. So it's important to state that it doesn't just stay the same. It doesn't just, oh, well, they do this every single time. No, they do this one time, and then they do this one time, and then this the next time, and then the next time. And then here we are all the way at the top when we started at the bottom with just a little bit of frequency or intensity. So it could get worse and more often. So that's important to take note of. It's a cycle of violence. It's not a one-time pattern. It's not a thing that just happens once. It usually is a cycle that happens over and over and over again. That's the definition of cycle. It can happen many times in an abusive relationship. Each stage lasts a different amount of time in that relationship, with the total cycle taking from a few hours to a year or more to complete. Emotional abuse is present in all stages. So emotional abuse is going to take place no matter what way, no matter where you are in that abusive relationship. Emotional abuse is taking place. Meaning that there's going to be that manipulation, there's going to be that feeling of superiority, making you feel bad because you said something or did something, those kind of things, manipulating the way that you view something or someone. Now, it's important to state that there are different kinds of abuse. So there is physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, technological abuse, financial abuse, and abuse by immigration status. So we automatically think of physical, emotional, and sexual, but a lot of times we forget that our world is such a technological world that if somebody is controlling what you can and can't do and online, then that is still abuse. It's still being super controlling. It's still, so if they say that you can't post certain things or you have to post certain things, those kind of things, if they take it to the level of abuse, then it's abuse, no matter which way you slice it. Another big one in domestic violence cases is financial abuse, is having that, if you make that the money in the relationship, you get to control that, aspect of it. So if somebody is in that role and they're being let me rephrase. If a person is in a domestic violence situation and their abuser has control of all the money, that's the way that they're able to take hold and keep them under their thumb, because they're like, oh, well, I have the right to the money. I control all of the bank accounts. I control what we can and can't buy. I control what you buy for the kids and what you don't buy for the kids, what you buy for yourself, what you don't buy for yourself. And then the last type of abuse is abuse by immigration status, by, throwing something in their face, being like, oh, well, you couldn't stay here if it weren't for me. And that's not always the case, but they're using that phrase, they're using that status really to control. So in all of these, that's what they're doing, is they're using something to control the other person. And again, this can be the male, this can be the female, this can be grandpa, roommate. It's not all just a fits-all kind of situation. It's not just a one shoe fits all. It doesn't work like that. There's so many different intricate parts, and we just want to keep that in mind. So the facts. What are we looking at whenever it comes to domestic violence? The CDC reports that more than 1 in 3 and 1 in 3 men, so 1 in 3 women, 1 in 3 men will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3 teens will also. So it's 1 in 3 across the board right now. We are super close. Women, it's a little bit more than 1 in 3, and men, it's right at 1 in 3. So for women, I think it's 1.23. So we're right here neck and neck. So it's not a man or woman. And I feel like I've said that a couple of times already, but I just want to stress that it's not a specific gender that is always in control of the domestic violence. It can be either one. So 1 in 3 women, 1 in 3 men, and 1 in 3 teens experience dating violence. Also, those who identify as non-binary, LGBTQ plus, are often even more likely to experience abuse. African American women are 35% more likely to experience domestic abuse than white women. While people at all income levels experience domestic violence, so all income levels experience domestic violence, those earning lower incomes experience domestic violence at higher rates than those with higher household incomes. There is a correlation with lower incomes. Women with household incomes of less than $7,500 are 7 times more likely as a woman with household incomes of over $75,000 to experience domestic violence. So 7 times more likely if you have a lower income. So there is a little bit of a tendency there. And so we just like to make note of it, that it can happen at all levels of income, but it tends to happen a little bit more at the lower levels of income. Those who identify as non-binary or LGBTQ plus are more likely to experience abuse, which is compounded by homophobia, transphobia, transgender women who experience intimate partner violence, were nearly 2.5 times more likely to experience sexual violence and nearly 4 times likely to experience financial abuse than survivors that did not identify as a transgender woman. So there's specific evidence supporting that transgender women face more of a chance of experience financial abuse, of a chance of experience sexual abuse in these situations. So just being aware of that and knowing that these are the facts that we're seeing today. These are the things that are happening right here, right now. National statistics show that at least 45% of domestic violence survivors report being sexually assaulted by their abuser. 45% report being sexually assaulted by their abuser. So that's a lot. That's almost half of domestic violence survivors saying that sexual abuse was a part. So we know that emotional abuse is always a part, but 45% state that sexual abuse was also a part. So that's important to remember. So usually this time would be for question and answer. And so what we're going to do, since we're going to look up what are some common questions, and then I'll just talk through those answers. And it is, if anybody is watching the playback, if you have any questions or anything that you're concerned about, or you want to report something, we can definitely get you any of that information. Everyone was sent the Laura's card in their email, and that has all of the domestic violence numbers and resources, shelters, all of those things that are really important. They're a really important aspect for us to have and for us to be able to lean on. So if something is happening, whether it be in your life or in someone that you know's life, you can reach out. You can call those hotline numbers. I think one of the most common questions that I get asked is, how do I know when to call the hotline number or when not to call the hotline number? So if you feel that that person is in any kind of danger, then I would call the hotline number. Now, if it's an immediate danger, call the police. If it's immediate. If it's someone just super controlling and you've noticed that at first it was just one thing, maybe it was just they couldn't have their phone after a certain time, or they wanted them to do something, it's just one thing that you thought, man, that's kind of off. I don't like that, but it's just one thing. But then you notice several things happening like that. And we're building that cycle, and we're noticing a trend, a pattern of consistency, of control. And like the statistics state, that it increases in intensity and frequency. So if you start to notice those things, then I would say call the hotline. Another good question that a lot of people ask is, why do victims sometimes return or stay with the abusers? So abusive partners work really hard to keep their victims trapped in the relationship. They may try to isolate the victims from friends and family, reducing the people and places where the survivor can go for support. Through various tactics of financial abuse, abusive partners can create financial barriers of safety. And what they do is that they convince you that you can't do it on your own, whether that be because you have this car payment or you have these bills, you're not going to be able to succeed. And that's not necessarily true. You may not be able to succeed in that environment, but once you're in a different environment, it definitely can change. There's a real fear of death and more abuse if they leave. If they've been told, if you leave me, then I'm going to, murder you. I'm going to do this, or I'm going to hurt myself. All of those things are tactics to keep the person staying there. And so whenever someone stays, it's not necessarily because they don't want to leave. It's because there are other factors that they're including that they're worried about, like being murdered or something along those lines. Gaslighting is another big reason. So abusive partners cause victims to feel like they're responsible for the abuse. They're responsible. So they have to say, because they're responsible for, so it's my fault. Oh man, if I would have done this, then they wouldn't have been mad at me. If I would have cooked dinner better, then they wouldn't have been upset with me. If I would have not spent so much money, then they wouldn't have been mad at me. But in reality, that's not the case at all. I think whenever I read this and I think about a situation in the news that we've kind of all seen, is the Gabby Petro situation. So the domestic violence that took place with that is whenever the police officers, you can watch the video online, whenever the police officers come, she literally takes ownership like it's her fault, even though the whole call was him hitting on her. And so it kind of switches, and you think, well, why does it do that? Well, it does that because he has manipulated that person into thinking that they are no longer, they're no longer able to get out of that situation, that it is their fault that they're in that situation. And that's not true. It wasn't true at all. It wasn't true for her. But it's also important to realize that in that moment, she paid the ultimate price for staying in that relationship and that kind of thing. So it's important to remember that whenever we're talking about domestic violence issues, that it can always turn to murder. It can always turn to homicide. It can turn to, we have those situations where one parent will kill the whole family and then kill themselves and things like that. So that's something that we want to be aware of in domestic violence. It's not something we necessarily want to focus on or something that we want to put all of our cards in, but we need to be aware that it does happen, and to call the hotline whenever you see things like that, to call the police. If you actively see someone in danger, call the police. They'll just do a welfare check, they'll check it out, they'll make sure that everything is okay. And again, we're at least documenting that these things are happening and hopefully getting that person one step closer to getting out of that situation. Is it possible for abusers to change? This question is a hard one, but I think it's possible to do anything if you set your mind to it. So yes, it's possible for that person to change. 100% it is possible for you to change, but you have to notice that it's happening, and you have to notice that you have to make behavior changes to change it. So if every single time that something happens and you get so angry that you put your hands on your significant other, whether that's a female or a male, or a female and a female, a male and a male, if you're getting so angry every single time that you're putting your hands on them, and you're noticing like, oh my goodness, these things are trends, these things are happening, you have to notice and then change your behavior to make sure that that's not continuing to happen. So once the abuser has all the power in a relationship, it's difficult to transition into a healthy relationship where each partner has power and respect. So it's hard to fix that relationship once it's happened, but it definitely is possible. It does take a lot of work and a lot of healing to change, but it's definitely possible. Sometimes the abusive partner stops one form of abuse, for example, physical violence, but continues to employ other forms of abuse, such as emotional, sexual, financial abuse. And it is important to remember that domestic violence includes one or more forms of abuse and is part of an overall pattern of seeking power and control over the victim. So we talked about that at the very beginning, where it's about seeking that control or that power. So if they're seeking that control and power, even if they're not doing it physically anymore, they're still seeking that power, then it's still domestic abuse. It's still domestic violence. So I'll just end with the question, what can you do? What can I do to help? So what we can do to help is we can call the police if we see something happening right then and there. We can call and try and get them help. Even if they don't take it, even if at least it's documented, at least we did what we can do. So it's important to remember that you can only do what you can do. In these situations, people have to make decisions that are best for them. So if they're in an unhealthy relationship, or if they're in a domestic violence situation, they have to make the decision for themselves to change, to get out of it, to do something different, whether that's the abuser or the abusee. It's important that both of them have to make that decision to change, to get out of it. And I think it's of utmost importance that the abusee gets out of that situation. So that's what we're focused on. We want to make sure that that person gets out of that situation alive and well. There are lots of resources. Like I said, everyone's student email should have got the Laura card, and on there it has every resource that you could possibly imagine. It has all the websites. There's links on there. It's a really, really, really good resource if you need some help. Then the hotline number is super easy to find. It is online. If you just Google domestic violence, the first thing that pops up is the hotline number. And so I'm going to read it out real quick. So the first thing that pops up is the hotline, and the hotline number is 800-799-7233. So I'm going to read it one more time. 800-799-7233. And again, you should have that on your email. You should have it in your doc. So if you need anything or you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. If you need anything at all, just holler. Thank you.